Fiscal restraint is on the horizon in Manitoba as the NDP government aims for an eventual balanced budget. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew promised to eliminate annual deficits by 2027 and says the government is looking at cutting costs in some areas. Mr. Kinew inherited a deficit from the former Tory government and has made tax cuts and spending commitments that have cost the Treasury more money. A political analyst says that the NDP will have a hard time getting to a balanced budget. And joining us now to discuss is Gage Haubrich, the Prairie Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Gage, thank you very much for sitting down with us.
Thanks for having me.
So what do you make of the pledge to balance the budget by 2027? Is it possible? What does the province need to look at cutting?
Well, taxpayers should certainly hope that it's possible. Right now, Manitoba's debt's going to be over $35 billion by the end of the year, and the government's spending over $2 billion per year on interest costs on that debt. It's over 20% of what all Manitoba taxpayers spend on the government. So they have to look at places to cut, and they have to find that way to get back to that balanced budget. In 2027, they say it's going to be balanced on a razor's edge at $18 million. And we look at what they should be cutting. There's some really quite simple ones. It's a whole of government problem. The government hasn't balanced the budget only once in the last 10 years. And a big part of that is huge growth in employee salaries. We've seen 64% more bureaucrats on the sunshine list over the last 2 years. That's bureaucrats making over $100,000. But unfortunately, since being elected, Premier Kinew has also hired $40 million in costs of new bureaucrats. So slashing those numbers is a good way to get closer back to balance to start off with.
And what about the revenue side of the equation here? Because obviously a balanced budget is always about that balance, revenues and spending. What would you make of the argument that all Manitoba needs to do is just look at different or more innovative ways to increase revenues through taxation?
Now, that's a really important question, but the answer to that question is that tax hikes should be off the table. We look at a family in Winnipeg with making about $75,000 a year. They're already paying more taxes than the same family in Regina, Toronto, and Calgary, and Vancouver. So there's no way the government doesn't have any room to hike these taxes because Manitobans are simply going to start leaving if they have to pay any more. This is completely not a revenue problem. It's a spending problem on the side of the government.
And on some of that spending, you mentioned the bureaucracy. How does Manitoba compare, let's say, to other provinces? Is their bureaucracy particularly bloated? Is that something that is a problem unique to the province of Manitoba?
So, of course, governments across the country like to spend. But when it comes to Manitoba, the unfortunate part is the government coming in, the NDP said they're going to look for places to cut costs, but instead decided to spend $40 million on hiring new bureaucrats. Now, that's not putting the money where the government's mouth is. It's not cutting expenditures. It's increasing costs.
Yeah, and I guess what would be, this is a tricky question for any premier, is how does one go about actually reducing the size of the bureaucracy? What do you think is the best path forward in terms of tackling the size and scope of the provincial government right now?
Well, there's a couple of ways. One of the easiest ways is attrition. So when someone retires, don't rehire someone for that new position. Try and offload some of the responsibilities to the business sector for things that the government shouldn't be involved in. And a good point on that in general and where the government should cut more is in corporate welfare. According to the Fraser Institute, Manitoba is spending about $500 million a year on corporate welfare subsidies. In the latest budget, they've announced even more. They have $50 million for a new fund. They want to give $10 million to a bus company to build some new buses. So cutting that kind of stuff is really easy. That's a good way to get government spending down.
Yeah, your organization has been focused on corporate welfare from Ottawa all the way down. Are there any other specifically egregious examples of corporate welfare in Manitoba beyond the bus example that you just gave us?
Well, one of the biggest ones is it's basically a wealth transfer scheme where the government's spending $25 million to subsidize brand new electric car buyers. You or I might have a hard time buying a brand new car, but for Manitobans who can afford to buy a brand new one, they can also expect to get a $4,000 check from the Manitoba government. So a good way to cut spending in there as well is to scrap this EV subsidy program and stop using money from poorer taxpayers to subsidize those more well off.
Gage, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us.
Thanks, David. Have a good one.